What is HIV/AIDS? HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus, is a virus that causes AIDS, or acquired immune deficiency syndrome. What type of virus is HIV? HIV is a special type of retrovirus containing RNA. There are 3 families of retroviruses called oncoviruses, lentiviruses, and splenoviruses, or splenoviruses. Types of retroviruses. Oncoviruses cause cancer. Lentiviruses are slow-acting viruses like HIV. And foamy-viruses are very uncommon, and we do not know a lot about them. Retroviruses replicate backwards. The order is the following: RNA to single-strand DNA, to double-strand DNA, to RNA, back to protein synthesis. How does HIV enter your system? The HIV virus enters your system through sexual contact, 3 types of intercourse, especially if done with somebody who already has the virus, cuts or sores in the mouth, reusing the needles without sterilization, and mother to child during childbirth. What type of cells does HIV target? HIV attacks your immune system, which purpose is to fight off infections. The HIV virus targets and affects the CD4 cells, or the T helper cells, located in the immune system. Without the T helper cells, the immune system cannot function properly. How HIV behaves in the host. After entering the system, HIV may not show symptoms for years, but if left untreated, the number of T helper cells will decrease steadily. When does HIV turn into AIDS? Once the number of T helper cells reaches 200 cells per cubic millimeter of blood, HIV is classified as AIDS. The steps to infect a cell. The first one is attachment. This virus attaches to the viron to the receptor of the cell. The next is fusion, then penetration, then uncoating, and reverse transcription. Continued steps to infect the cell. DNA synthesis, migration, integration, viral transcription, RNA nuclear transport, protein synthesis, packaging and reassembly, re-encapsulation, and budding.
Symptoms of HIV and AIDS by Todd Crenshaw. Acute HIV. Acute HIV is a flu-like illness that shows up a month or 2 after the virus enters the body. This is the first stage of HIV. The symptoms are as follows: fever, headache, muscle aches and joint pain, rash, sore throat, fatigue, swollen lymph glands, diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, and a red rash that doesn't itch, usually on the torso. Chronic HIV, a second stage of the virus. In some people, there will be persistent swelling of the lymph nodes, but the virus mostly remains dormant during this about 10-year period. HIV infection. The symptoms for this are as follows: fever, fatigue, swollen lymph nodes, often one of the first signs of HIV infection, diarrhea, weight loss, oral yeast infection, and shingles. Progression to AIDS. If you receive no treatment, the viruses will progress to AIDS and your immune system will be severely damaged. The symptoms are as follows: soaking night sweats, recurring fever, chronic diarrhea, persistent white spots, unusual lesions on your tongue or in your mouth, persistent unexplained fatigue, weight loss, skin rashes or bumps, sores of the mouth, anus, or genitals, pneumonia, red, brown, pink, or purplish blotches on or under the skin, inside the mouth, nose, or eyelids, and finally, memory loss, depression, and other neurological disorders. Here are my sources.
The 3 stages of HIV and AIDS. There are 3 stages to HIV and AIDS, which include acute infection, clinical latency, and finally AIDS. Acute infection. During this stage, the virus is reproducing at a very high rate in the victim's body. The virus is overwhelming your immune system. During this stage, the victim will experience symptoms described as the worst flu ever. For most people, these symptoms arrive 2 to 4 weeks after the initial infection. Symptoms also include fever, swollen glands, sore throat, rash, muscle and joint aches and pains, and severe headaches. Clinical latency. During this stage, the victim does not show any symptoms of HIV. This is because the virus is reproducing at a very low level, even though it is still active. For some people, this stage can last from a few years to multiple decades. If the victim is receiving proper treatment, this will last for multiple decades. At the end of this stage, the CD4 levels on the victim will begin to decline. The third and final stage is AIDS. This stage is triggered when the immune system is damaged or weakened in some way. Once the CD4 levels of the victim drops below 200 cells per cubic millimeter, the person is considered to have AIDS. Without proper treatment, people who progress to AIDS typically survive about 3 years. You may never progress to this stage if you are not exposed to viral infections often.
Right now, there are around 1.1 million people in the United States living with HIV or AIDS. HIV and AIDS entered the United States in the 1980s. Since the disease diffused to the U.S., around 600,000 people have lost their lives. Every year, there are around 50,000 new cases in the U.S. alone. The southern U.S. accounts for the most HIV and AIDS diagnoses in the country, with the Northeast a close second. As of 2011, there were an estimated 250,000 people living with HIV and AIDS in the Caribbean. In 2011, there are an estimated 13,000 new cases of HIV, with 10,000 deaths from HIV and AIDS. The biggest factor in the spread of HIV in the region is unprotected sex, but drug users and homosexuals also play a role. Currently, in South and Latin America, there are around 1.5 million people with AIDS. This equates to about 0.4% of the current population in South and Latin America. There are around 80,000 new cases each year, and about 52,000 deaths from HIV and AIDS. In South and Latin America, it is estimated that homosexuals account for around half of new HIV diagnoses in 2012. It is also estimated that 6.1% of female sex workers are living with HIV. In South and Latin America, over 75% of those infected were able to receive treatment needed. That is among the higher rates in the middle to low income areas/countries. Sub-Saharan Africa has the most cases of HIV and AIDS in the entire world. As of 2012, nearly 25 million people were living with HIV in Sub-Saharan Africa. This accounts for nearly 70% of the global total. In that same year, there were an estimated 1.6 million new cases. This region also contains Swaziland, which has the highest HIV prevalence rate of any country in the world at 26.5%. These staggering numbers are due to poor sexual education and sanitary conditions. At the end of 2011, it was estimated that around 900,000 people were living with AIDS in Western and Central Europe. There were 30,000 new cases of HIV in 2011, and at that same time, there were around 7,000 AIDS-related deaths. The majority number of cases come from homosexual men. The region, as a whole, has an HIV prevalence rate of 0.2%. There are currently around 1.4 million people in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central America and Central Asia living with HIV and AIDS. This amounts to a 1% HIV prevalence. In 2011, there were 140,000 new cases and 92,000 deaths from AIDS-related illness. Since 2001, the region has seen a 250% increase in HIV prevalence. This makes the region home to the fastest-growing AIDS epidemic in the world. The rise of HIV and AIDS in the area is due to an increase in drug users and sex workers in the area. As of 2011, there are around 48 million people infected with HIV in Southern Asia and Australia. This region has an HIV prevalence rate of 0.4%. The three main causes for HIV in the region are unprotected sex, drug users, and homosexuals. Certain countries such as Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand have made progress combating HIV and AIDS, and these countries have seen up to a 25% decrease in HIV prevalence, while countries such as Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the Philippines have seen a 25% increase in the HIV prevalence rate.
The transmission of HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS can be transmitted in 4 different ways. Transmission of HIV and AIDS through blood. Blood has the highest risk of transmission because this is where the white blood cells are located in the body. HIV and AIDS targets these cells. This is why there is such a high risk when it comes to blood-on-blood contact. Tattooing is considered a high-risk factor in HIV and AIDS. This is because if the needle is not new, little drops of blood cling to the needle. This not only occurs in tattooing, but also in other needles used to inject drugs, vaccines, and other substances. A blood transfusion or organ transplant can also transmit HIV or AIDS, although it is very rare for this to occur. Sex. HIV and AIDS can be transferred through semen, preseminal fluid, vaginal fluids, and rectal fluids. Anal sex has the highest risk of transmitting HIV or AIDS. There may also be small cuts or sores in the epidermis of the penis or vagina, which HIV and AIDS can transmit through. Oral sex. Oral sex does not have as high of a risk as intercourse, but is still higher than other ways of transmission. Oral sex includes the mouth and penis or mouth and vagina. It is transmitted through semen, preseminal fluid, or vaginal fluid. These fluids enter the mouth and if swallowed, then the virus can be absorbed into the membranes of the digestive system. It is not killed by stomach acid or saliva. Pregnancy, birth, and breast milk. Another way HIV and AIDS can be transmitted is when the child is in the parental unit's womb, while giving birth, or when breastfeeding the child. The way it is transmitted is the same as the previous slide. These activities are not as high of a risk as sexual activities, but are still a risk.
The mortality rate of HIV and AIDS. The mortality rate means the number of deaths per particular cause. For example, the mortality rate of Ebola is 70%. This means that for every 10 people that contract Ebola, 7 of them will die. What is the total amount of deaths caused by HIV and AIDS in the U.S.? According to the CDC, the total number of recorded deaths in the U.S. caused by HIV and AIDS is 6,955. The total deaths per 100,000 people in a population is 2.2. The total amount of diagnoses is around 900,000. What state in the U.S. has the most cases of HIV and AIDS? Currently, the state in the U.S. with the most cases of AIDS is Washington, D.C. This is surprising because California and New York are larger, yet don't have as many cases. How many people have been diagnosed with HIV or AIDS in the world? According to the World Health Organization, since 2013, there have been 35 million people living with HIV or AIDS. The majority of these people currently reside in sub-Saharan Africa. How many people have died from HIV or AIDS since the first reports? The first reports of HIV and AIDS were around 1981 to 1982. An estimated 39 million people have died from AIDS since then.
HIV and AIDS Treatments and Cures by Andrew Lanham. Sadly, there are currently no cures for HIV or AIDS. There are a few treatments for this monstrous disease, though. Thankfully, a variety of drugs can be used together to somewhat control it. The treatments are used to reduce HIV in your body, strengthen your immune system to fight it, and decrease problems you may face while fighting it. What is known as an HIV cocktail or regimen is a mixture of many prescribed drugs to treat HIV. The cocktails are technically called HAART, or Highly Active Antiretroviral Therapy. HAART slows the rate at which HIV replicates itself. There are many prescribed drugs used to treat HIV. HIV medicines are divided into 6 drug classes. These classes are non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, or NNRTIs, nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, or NRTIs, protease inhibitors, or PIs, fusion inhibitors, FIs, CCR5 antagonists, CCR5s, and finally, integrase strand transfer inhibitors, or INSTIs. Scientists are constantly researching and looking for a cure for HIV. Vaccines have been our strongest weapon against history's deadliest diseases, such as smallpox, polio, etc. Vaccines for HIV are something that scientists are researching now. HIV is tricky though, as it evades the immune system with ease. Finding an effective vaccine for HIV is one of the top priorities for many HIV research centers. There is not yet a vaccine for HIV, but progress is being made. Can we ever cure HIV? As time goes on, HIV is mutating, therefore making it harder to research and keep up with in the lab. If HIV keeps mutating and we can't stop it, we may never cure it. There seems to be some hope for someday curing HIV though.
Important people associated with AIDS/HIV. Arthur Ashe. He was the first African-American tennis player to be selected to the U.S. Davis Cup team. He was the only African-American man ever to win singles at Wimbledon, the U.S. Open, and the Australian Open. He reportedly contracted HIV from a blood transfusion during heart surgery. He founded the Arthur Ashe Foundation for the Defeat of AIDS and the Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health. Unfortunately, Ashe died of AIDS-related pneumonia in 1993. President Bill Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his efforts to rid the disease and to end discrimination in all sports. Freddie Mercury was the front man and lead singer for the British rock band Queen. The Rolling Stone named him number 18 on the list of 100 greatest singers ever. Mercury died of bronchopneumonia brought on by AIDS in 1991. Eazy-E was part of the influential rap group NWA. He earned the nickname Godfather of Gangsta Rap. He died of AIDS complications only a month after diagnosis. I've got thousands and thousands of young fans that have to learn about what's real when it comes to AIDS. I've learned in the last week that this thing is real and it doesn't discriminate. It affects everyone. Magic Johnson was one of America's best basketball players for 12 years. He played for the Los Angeles Lakers. In 1991, Magic Johnson retired from the Lakers after revealing that he had HIV. He founded the Magic Johnson Foundation to support HIV/AIDS research efforts. In 1992, along with Michael Jordan and Larry Bird, Magic played in the Summer Olympic Games on the American Dream Team that won the gold medal. Bill Goldsworthy. Goldsworthy played for 3 NHL teams. He tallied 283 goals and 250 assists. He was the first pro hockey player publicly known to have AIDS.
The history of HIV/AIDS.
There are multiple theories on the origin of HIV. The hunter theory is the most widely accepted theory. It says HIV passed to humans through SIV in chimpanzees. Tribes in Africa then ate the infected flesh and blood of the chimpanzees, and the disease mutated or evolved to become HIV. Hard to think that these little guys could have caused such a terrible disease. Colonialism theory. Many countries had labor camps in Africa where the workers were mistreated. They were already malnourished and unhealthy, and their bodies may have easily contracted HIV from non-sterile needles or chimps with SIV. Polio vaccine theory. Another theory states that polio vaccines in certain African countries were contaminated with flesh from chimpanzees with SIV because the vaccines needed live tissue, and the live tissue used was from the chimps. There's also a conspiracy theory that the US government created HIV to reduce the population, especially of African Americans and homosexuals. It was discovered in 2007 that HIV had entered the US primarily from Haiti. At the time, many people from Haiti were returning from working in the Congo during the 1960s. They brought HIV from the Congo or other parts of Western Africa to Haiti. HIV then spread around the island of Haiti before probably being brought to the US through the gay community in the late 1960s to early 1970s. So HIV spread from sub-Saharan Africa to Haiti, then to the United States. June 5, 1981 was the first reported case of HIV. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention reported cases of a rare lung infection in 5 young, previously healthy gay men. There were also new cases of a rare cancer. Doctors needed to order a refill for the medication, which almost never happened. Most people overcame the infection in about 2 weeks and were healthy again. This showed that something was wrong with the patient's immune system. People noticed HIV was occurring in hemophiliacs, injecting drug users, and Haitians. It was widely believed by scientists that HIV was sexually transmitted. It was first called Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS. AIDS cases were growing rapidly, from 270 cases in 1981 to 3,064 cases in 1983. By 1989, there were roughly 400,000 cases of AIDS worldwide. The 4-H club was homosexuals, heroin addicts, Haitians, and hemophiliacs. These people faced lots of discrimination. Children with HIV were sometimes banned from school, and adults would lose their jobs. There was lots of distrust. In 1983, French scientists isolated a virus they believed to be the cause of AIDS. They named it LAV. Around the same time, CDC researchers found what they thought was the cause of AIDS. They named it HTVL3. It turns out LAV and HTVL3 were the same virus. In 1986, it was named HIV for Human Immunodeficiency Virus. In 1987, the World Health Organization launched the global program on AIDS to raise awareness and provide support. December 1st was declared National AIDS Day. Many countries released pamphlets or ads to broadcast PSAs warning about AIDS and giving information on how to prevent it. Because of the many advertisements by the CDC, condom use rose from 14% in 1989 to 94% in 1993. By 1995, AIDS was the leading cause of death for people aged 25 to 44, but the epidemic itself was slowing down. There were about 6 million cases worldwide of HIV and 500,000 cases of AIDS in the US alone. In 1996, FDA released the first home sampling kit to determine if someone had HIV. Before, you had to go to your doctor to get a testing, but now with the new kit, you could do it in your own home and get the results by phone. 1996 was the first year the number of deaths from AIDS dropped, but many people were still infected, and AIDS was growing as a major cause of death. In 1999, AIDS became the 4th leading cause of death in the world, less than 20 years after the epidemic had started. By 2011, however, AIDS dropped to the 6th leading cause of death. The Global Fund for AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria was founded in 2001. 5,000 scientists from around the world also signed the Durban Declaration, saying that HIV is definitely the cause of AIDS. In 2003, the World Health Organization and joint UN programs on HIV/AIDS announced a new plan. They wanted to provide 3 million people in less developed countries with antiretroviral treatment by 2005. Unfortunately, by 2006, only 1.3 million people were being treated in poor countries. This was less than half the goal. There's a new brand in 2006 called Product Red that partners with large companies to raise awareness and money for AIDS in Africa. It partnered with Nike, Starbucks, Apple, Coca-Cola, and many more. The annual number of AIDS deaths declined from 2.2 million in 2005 to 2 million in 2007. In 2009, Barack Obama launched the Global Health Initiative to address health issues in poorer countries. He also lifted the HIV travel and immigration ban in 2009. By 2010, the spread of HIV had been halted and reversed. Now the challenge is how quickly we can end the epidemic. By 2012, 54% of people who needed antiretroviral treatment were receiving it.
Unusual or Pertinent Facts About AIDS by Liam Gray. About the diffusion of AIDS. In 1969, a teenager by the name of Robert died of a mysterious disease which was later identified as AIDS. This was the first known death from AIDS in the USA. AIDS spread from Africa to the rest of the world within 10 years. Robert Rayford. Robert Rayford died in the St. Louis hospital due to a mysterious disease which was later identified as AIDS. The cause of his death was unknown until 1989 when a doctor at Tulane University identified it as AIDS. Diffusion. Professor Roy Anderson predicted that it would take 130 years for AIDS to work its way through the world's population. Expansion diffusion. HIV/AIDS will weaken as it spreads to newer areas. This is similar to the case with H1N1 in Mexico. Relocation diffusion. HIV can be spread through relocation diffusion. This means that someone with HIV could get on a plane and fly to a new country and affect the people that he or she encounters. The combination of relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion are examples of how HIV can diffuse so quickly. More facts. About 1 million people in the United States are living with HIV/AIDS today. Every 9 minutes, someone in the U.S. is infected with AIDS. If AIDS keeps diffusing as it does and does not get a specific cure, every 1 in 16 black males and every 1 in 32 black females will have AIDS. Around 90% of children with AIDS are living in sub-Saharan Africa. The first case of AIDS was discovered in a blood sample in Congo in 1959. Children with AIDS. A young Swahili girl has around an 80% chance of dying from AIDS. Around 3.34 million children are living with AIDS today. Although mother-to-child AIDS is very avoidable with proper treatment, AIDS can be transferred through breastfeeding. Almost all the mothers in sub-Saharan Africa do not receive proper maternal treatment, so the chance for a child to get AIDS grows. Types of HIV. There are 3 different types of HIV: HIV-1, HIV, and HIV-2. HIV-1 came from a chimpanzee and HIV-2 came from an African monkey. The deadliest form of HIV is HIV-1. HIV was at first very weak and was able to be stopped by the human immune system. As it evolved and mutated, it had become much stronger, and by the time it was identified, it was already too late to be stopped. Patient Zero. Gaëtan Dugas was a French-Canadian flight attendant nicknamed Patient Zero because of his role he played in the spread of AIDS. Dugas had AIDS and was supposedly the cause for many deaths in the 1980s. Dugas was homosexual and had many different partners in which he transferred HIV to. His partners also had different partners, which led to the spread of the disease. Gaëtan Dugas died of HIV in 1984. Many HIV deaths during the 80s were traced back to this flight attendant. Indifference towards victims. The attitude towards HIV patients has not been as kind as it should be. People accuse many homosexuals for causing the disease and spreading the disease. Many people hear that someone has AIDS and instantly assume that he or she is gay without understanding the situation they would be coming from.